I thought you said you were going into the song.
Yeah, let's do it. All right. Everyone ready? Okay. Travel the world and the 7 bees. Everybody's looking for swarms. Some of them land on buildings. Some of them land on high top trees. Some of them land on bait hives. Then you get your bees for free. Travel the world and the 7 bees. Everybody's looking for queens. Some of them want the Russians. Some of them want the VSH. Some of them want Mite biters. None of them want to get stung in the face. You need your hive tool. You love your hive tool. Where's your hive tool? Sweet dreams are made of bees. Who has a hive to lend to me? Travel the world and the 7 bees. Everybody's looking for bees. Everybody's looking for bees. Everybody's looking for bees. All right. Welcome, everybody. We figured we'd start with that to help us wake up. How's everybody doing? How's morale this morning? Fine Sunday morning in the fine town of Eugene. This is my friend Ray. She's a beekeeper in Michigan, keeps about 50 hives. And Solomon Parker's in the back there with his bees, just a little south of here in Medford. And I think both of them will get a little chance to talk about what they're doing with their beekeeping operations. But I'm Sam Comfort. I run Anarchy Apiaries. I have about 1,000 beehives. I've been a commercial beekeeper for 15 years. Today I consider myself a recovering commercial beekeeper. But who here has bees? You all mostly beekeepers? Who here needs bees, wants to go in here? We have both have bees and want bees, but yeah, it sounds like most of you are we're all on the same page pretty much. So I gotta get a sense of where we're all at because the beekeeping vocabulary is pretty esoteric, and I can talk a little bit about queen rearing, talk a little bit about what I do, and it can get a little bit overwhelming, even for me. So. But I'm glad you're all here. Thanks for coming out. I've been in Eugene a couple days visiting my friend Bill Wood, who builds these Warre hives, like beautiful designed, custom biodynamic infused boxes for bees. I keep a bunch of boxes like this. I keep a bunch of boxes like this. I have Kenyan top bar hives. I have Langstroth hives, a little bit of everything. It's kind of chaos in my bee yard, but so I'll talk a little bit about my story, how I got into bees leading up to what I do today, some tips and tricks. But I got into bees when I won my first 6 hives in a poker game, which isn't actually true. It's just the best story that I've come up with. Really, it wasn't that easy or sweet. Actually, I knew friends who had beekeeper buddies who had 1,000 hives in Vermont who said I could park my van out back at the honey house and just go to work getting stung for a living, and that's totally what happened. I mean, my first day, I think I got stung 5 or 6 times in the neck, even before I got the veil on. I'd never been around bees before. I knew nothing about bees, and I freaked out. I ran out of that bee yard. The bees chased me for a little bit, but then they settled down, and I caught my breath, I sat down, I started picking these stingers out of my neck, and I looked up at this beautiful blue sky and this green field on this Vermont spring day, and I waited to see if I was gonna die. And I didn't die, and somehow I finished out that first day, and for some reason I came back the next day, and at that point I was totally hooked on beekeeping. I realized beekeeping was the hardest thing that I had ever done. So for that reason I knew I wanted to stick with it, and now it's 15 years later. But the first thing that they told me on the job was that the bees weren't doing well. It was hard to keep them alive. They were sick. Not a lot of them survived winter. It was hard to run a business. They were keeping it together by harvesting raw honey and making it into a line of plant medicine products, like a propolis throat spray. Propolis, for those of you who are new, is a bee glue. They coat the inside of their hives with it, and it's an antibacterial, antifungal, antiviral substance that the bees use as their immune system. So this business would harvest that, making it into a throat spray. They made an elderberry extract with raw honey, a bunch of plant medicine products that were really neat value-added products to use their honey and base their business on. And you know, I was there for a couple months getting stung for a living, and I don't open with this getting stung story to intimidate you new beekeepers. These days, getting stung is my favorite part of keeping bees. If you don't get stung, the honey doesn't taste as sweet. But you know, in addition to its medicinal benefits and like reversing arthritis, multiple sclerosis, I find that the chance of getting stung keeps me focused. Keeps me present. It keeps me totally aware and awake every time I open up a beehive. And it also keeps me constantly in check. It keeps me slowing down, whereas all my life I've been told to hurry up all the time. So beekeeping and then the bees have been really good teachers in that regard, of just being able to focus on what I'm doing and be in that moment. And I've been able to apply that into forming the business and any aspect of life. Is this gift that the bees have really given me. So, you know, I do not try to avoid getting stung at all. I don't even wear a veil most of the time, but I do get stung. I get stung in the face. It happens, you know. I make mistakes, and the bees let me know. But so they're really good in letting me know when I'm out of line. But you know, I was there in Vermont for a couple months, and it seemed that all my friends were moving to Brooklyn in New York City, so I decided on a whim to move to Montana, and I got a job with a beekeeper out of the phone book there my first day in Montana, and I signed up for a 5,000 hive operation. We had 4 hives on a pallet. We picked up the pallets with forklifts. We put 500 hives in a semi-truck, and we shipped them thousands of miles down to Central California to pollinate almonds. When that bloom was over, we shipped them up to Washington to pollinate apples, and then back to Montana to pollinate all the cherry trees around Flathead Lake, and then we did a couple melons and vine crops, but mostly we were just revamping these bees through the rest of the year to do this pollination gauntlet again. Those guys barely broke even in selling honey. Over 80% of the honey consumed in this country is coming in from overseas at pennies a pound. Commercial beekeepers can't compete with that cheap honey, and a lot of it isn't even honey. So they're making a living these days doing this migratory pollination, and it's very, very tough on these bees. They're going from monoculture to monoculture farm that is just poisoning and malnourishing them. You add the stress of being on the road, and it's really no secret why bees are dying. So the biggest problem that they'll admit is that there's not a lot of young blood coming into this industry to take up this mantle. It's just such a difficult livelihood, and it's really not that much fun to wake up in the morning. You have to medicate your bees, you have to feed your bees, you have to move your bees thousands of miles in order to make ends meet, just to have bees that stay alive in this farming system that they're forced into. And it's really the hard work and the innovation of these commercial beekeepers that are enabling our food production in the U.S. The U.S. is already a net food importer. We're not even feeding ourselves at this point. What food we are producing is supported by these commercial migratory pollinators. So these aren't the bad guys. They don't want to have to push their bees through this system. Nobody wants to medicate bees or use antibiotics or do all this supplemental feeding, but they figure if they were to stop doing this, their bees would crash. What these guys need are beehives that grow all the time. They're constantly losing hives. The queens are either dying, or the bees are getting exposed to things and aren't living that long sublethally. And So they want hives that they can constantly split one hive into two to replace their dead hives. So what they want is a kind of bee, the genetics that grow all the time, turn all their food, all the honey, into more bees, more bees, more bees, more worker bees, so they make more hives, split every hive in two constantly to support their dead ones. And so they're using an Italian-based bee that's used to a Mediterranean climate with constant honey flows that is constantly making more bees. And so if they're making more bees, if there isn't that honey flow, then they have to do supplemental feeding. And since they're raising brood all the time, they're also raising parasites that are on this brood. So they have to be medicated to knock down those parasites constantly. The main one, of course, is Varroa mites. And Varroa mites are also vectors for a number of bee diseases that often people are using antibiotics, even just prophylactically, in order to they have to do all these things. And if they were to get off this wagon, they would not have bees left in their bee yard. You never missed a time to feed, and you never missed a time to treat in this kind of operation. And these guys are locked in, and it's really not that much fun a lot of times of the year when you're just trying to have the support system to keep their hives alive. So I learned the ropes through this for about 5-6 years. After Montana, I moved to Florida. I worked for a guy with 15,000 hives, got introduced to a whole new set of pests and problems, hive beetles, 4 different species of ants that will kill a hive. And we did blueberries in Maine, cranberries in Massachusetts, and citrus in Florida. It's really just a bug race. You know, running this pollination gauntlet is really hard, but I mean, these guys work really hard to really make ends meet and keep their bees alive. So I knew I was never going to pick up this mantle and be a migratory pollinator. I didn't like this whole kind of factory bee farming model, and of course the monoculture farming didn't really resonate with me as well. But you know, I really learned the ropes from these guys, and I learned bee biology and how bees are so versatile and so adaptive. So after I got a couple of my own hives, I started raising my own queens, and I taught myself how to do a production method of queen raising called grafting. Grafting is the process of picking up a larva from a breeder hive. People have been grafting since the late 1800s, and the premise has always been to get better bees. You know, grow bees, breed bees that will make more honey, making more money for the beekeeper. It's a kind of a profit-driven breeding program for decades and decades, until what it has left us with in this country is a very shallow gene pool. Bees that are constantly growing, building up for honey flows that may or may not happen in this changing climate. So what I'm doing with this grafting process, right from the get-go, when I started raising queens, I wanted to reverse some of the trends that commercial beekeeping was going, because I don't think bees are like livestock. They're not like cows. Cows have become hooked on antibiotics and supplemental feeding, whereas bees have always been wild until the mid-1800s. And I think they retain this resilience. They're able to survive on their own. I know bee trees and bees and hives and buildings that have gone for years and years without any manipulations, without any feeding, and they take care of themselves. Not only do they take care of themselves, they split themselves. They swarm at least once or twice a year and are propagating their survivor genetics. So it's a well-known fact that bees don't need beekeepers, whereas in the commercial setting, bees are really going that route where they can't survive without these artificial crutches. So I was trying to breed bees that could once again survive on their own. Of course, the major survival tactic that these bees need is to handle Varroa mites. They're like little red ticks that crawl around on the bees, chew on their fat bodies, and they're vectors for numerous bee diseases, just like ticks, like Lyme disease, for us humans. So rather than trying to breed bees for more production, I was picking bees that could handle Varroa mites. They didn't have shriveled wings, deformed wing virus, and things like that. And not only were they resistant to the mites and the diseases, but they could survive winter. They were healthy and strong enough to make honey. They had good temperament, and all these things just kind of capitalizing on the robustness of certain hives that were the breeders. And what I would do is go into a very strong hive that I picked as my breeder queen, and I would pick up a larva with this little flexible tongue here. This is the Chinese push-button grafting tool. And I will pick up the larva out of the breeder hive and put it into a queen cup like this. And it has this little push-button slide here, and I could slide that larva into this queen cup. And I would make a whole bunch of these queen cups, and I would take them and I would put them into a very strong queenless hive. I would go to a beehive, I would remove the queen, I would remove all the other eggs and larvae, and I would leave it queenless and without the ability to raise their own queen. I let them sit like that for a couple hours, and this is stressful for those bees. This is manipulative, invasive beekeeping, setting up what we call a cell raiser, like that. But after a couple hours, I would put in 30 or 40, or you can even do 50 of these queen cups. And each one of these queen cups would be raised into a queen cell. 10 days after this grafting process, I will go in and I will get these extra queen cells and I will put them each into a little tiny baby hive. I can make splits from my hives, or I could cage queens and sell them to other beekeepers, but I would replace them with a queen cell. A virgin queen emerges from this queen cell in another day or two. About a week later, she goes on a mating flight. She leaves the hive, goes about a mile away, about 100 feet up in the air. She mates with 15 or 20 or more drones in a single mating flight, and comes back and starts laying eggs and just resetting the whole hive population. And I started doing this again and again, raising what I was calling survivor stock. So I will pass this around, this little grafting tool, and you can check it on out. So I learned this and I kind of honed it by working for other commercial queen raisers. And if anyone's ever bought a queen or bought a package of bees or bought a nucleus, 99.9% of the time that queen came from this grafting process, which I agree is like invasive and manipulative and stressful for these bees. But the means to the end, it creates this ability to produce queens very quickly in a single box like that. And I still do quite a bit of grafting, but I'm going to mostly talk about some alternative methods or some simpler methods that we can all do in our backyards for you. But I'll run through that program all the way up to the way I do things today. I run about 1,000 hives, and I raise about 3,000 queens a year. And I ship these across the country. Every week I show up at the post office with a stack of buzzing envelopes. The postal employees think it's weird, I think it's weird. But I show up with a jar of honey, and the queens always tend to get there on time, usually. So. And again, when people are buying a queen from me, they don't just have a queenless hive in an emergency. They're really looking for the genetics of these survivor bees that I'm raising. So I use a lot of Russian bees that are extremely hardy in winter and have a grooming behavior that knock these Varroa mites off of each other. And I also use a lot of VSH bees, which means Varroa sensitive hygiene, bees that have been bred in the USDA Baton Rouge lab to have a very acute sense of smell. And they can smell when when a bee pupa is infested by a Varroa mite, and they will remove that pupa before the mite can come to the completion of its reproductive cycle, and they're able to take out the mites from the hive that way. So those are two really strong traits that are naturally occurring in bees, but breeding programs have really augmented them, and those are the kind of genetics that I'm using to be treatment-free. I'm a treatment-free beekeeper. I've been treatment-free for 13 years. I've been raising queens also for 13 years, and really of those 13 years of queen raising, I've never done it the same way twice. So there's many different ways to do it. I'll just talk about a couple of them today, and I'll talk a little bit about being treatment free. But to me, it doesn't matter if you're treatment free or not, whether you have to medicate for Varroa mites or not, or whether you have to feed bees or not. I run Anarchy Apiaries. You know, anarchy does not make rules for other beekeepers. I don't want this us and them mentality. We don't need our bee world polarized in this way, the treaters and the non-treaters. There's good and bad beekeepers on both sides. This is very true. I mean, the way I do my program, it's a constant work. I'm constantly making more splits, and I'm constantly testing the stock and selecting from the best mothers to lead the next generation. And it's been constant improvement in that regard. But, you know, I run 1,000 hives these days. My long-term goal is to work down to 5 hives. 5 hives, a fishing pole, a hammock, and a network of us sustainable beekeepers who in our backyard we have 5 or 10 hives, who in a bad year, say we lose half or more of our bees, we know how to split our survivors. Rather than buying in bees from commercial sources, those commercial bees, they come with really virulent mites and the diseases that they're vectored in with, and also they're just not adapted to these local climatic conditions that are around here in Oregon. So rather than doing that and buying in bees, you know, you can split your own couple of survivor hives and replace your numbers. And in a good year, say most of your bees survive, you can have an extra split or an extra swarm to bring to your bee club, to give to your neighbor, and we can really create this bee it forward mentality that I see as the real viable future of beekeeping in this country. Because the commercial situation, these beekeepers, their operations, they're the first ones to admit that they've created a monster, and by no means is their situation sustainable. It's getting worse and worse. Varroa mites have been in this country for over 30 years, and they started with a couple chemical treatments that worked for a couple years, then the treatments failed, the mites became resistant, and then they tried some more chemicals, and it's just like this just chain of chemicals that they've been trying to put into beehives, and meanwhile the mites are just getting worse and worse, more and more aggressive and more virulent. You put it in a treatment, you might kill 90–95% of your mites. It might buy you some time in that hive, but that last 5% of mites that's alive will be your most virulent, your most aggressive, and their mites are changing and adapting and getting stronger all the time that you're treating, whereas you're only propping up these weaker genetics. Whereas if beekeepers never treated, it's generally agreed that if we never treated for mites, we'd be over this problem by now. Sure, there'd be a genetic bottleneck in our bee population. People's wallets would get lighter, for sure. Beekeepers would probably have gone out of business, like many of them did, even when they did treat at first. But by now, 3 decades later, we'd be over this mite problem. And bees would be back to normal. Bees have this grooming behavior, this hygienic behavior, they have the swarming behavior of breaking their brood cycle. The mites need the brood to reproduce. If you remove that queen, like in this grafting process, you have a period that there are no eggs being laid in this hive, and so that breaks up the brood cycle. The mites are constantly looking for open larvae to jump onto so they can reproduce in the capped brood. Breaking up that brood cycle breaks up the mites' reproduction cycle. And this is something that bees do naturally when they swarm. The old queen leaves the hive in a swarm with about half the bees, and you have almost 3 weeks of no eggs being laid in that beehive. The hive is totally broodless when by the time the new queen starts to lay eggs. So the mites are all phoretic. They're all crawling around on the bees, exposed to their grooming behavior. And so I found that breaking the brood cycle, even if you don't have survivor genetics or other ways to take stress off your bees, this breaking the brood cycle became a real tactic for me when I was getting going to knock down the mites and keep them below a killing threshold in my hives, and being able to avoid treatments while I was really working with the survivor stock and strengthening their genetics and doing everything I could to take the stress off the hive and just support their immune system, support their ability to take care of themselves, rather than just trying to treat the mites and put a band-aid on the problem. Really, the mites are just the symptom. The cause is a little bit under the surface. It's just that the bees are out of balance. They're not adapted. They haven't been allowed to co-evolve with this parasite-host relationship, where in the best interest of the parasite, it doesn't want to kill its host, but bees have this ability. They have all these different tactics. I think they have over 70 million years of honeybees in this world. I think they have the ability to solve problems. It's almost like they know what they're doing. So trying to strengthen the bees rather than just trying to treat the symptom was the tactic that I took. But it's not the common approach, and there's only a handful of us treatment-free beekeepers who are doing survivor stock breeding in this country. But we find that every generation they are getting stronger, and we're having a lot of success in it. So I was building up my numbers and starting to work with survivor stock, and I had taught myself to raise queens in 2005, and I started building up my numbers till I had about 150 to about 200 hives or so, and they were growing. I was spending all my time with them. I quit working for other commercial beekeepers so I could focus on my own bees. And then one spring they started to grow out of the little nuke boxes, the little nucleus hives that I was raising queens in. I looked around and I didn't have another frame or another box or anything to put these growing hives into. And I was out of money at that point. I was a broke beekeeper trying to just build up an operation. So it was then that I really stumbled onto the mission of Anarchy Apiaries. It's to bring the means of production back to the beekeeper, to make beekeeping a lot simpler, a lot more affordable, a lot more feasible, a lot more approachable than it has been in the last 150 years. Really, 150 plus years ago, everybody kept bees. You would either get some straw and weave it into a basket, what's called a skep hive, or you get a log and hollow it out to make a gum hive, or just hammer 4 boards together and make a box hive. But there virtually was no bee industry. The bees were wild. They would swarm out to the woods. Sometimes they'd come back. And this kind of beekeeping was done sustainably for thousands of years. Often people would kill off their hives with sulfur gas in order to harvest the honey. They never killed all of them. They let some behind to swarm and repopulate their hives, but there was just an abundance of bees. Everyone had dogs, cats, and bees. You talk to folks, everyone's grandparents, great-grandparents had bees. There were bees on every farm, church, school. I think somehow beehives got replaced by televisions. Because really, back in the day, if you're done your chores on the farm, you have an hour at daylight, you go and watch the beehive. It's the most exciting thing going on the farm. You watch the entrance and the different colors of pollen coming in. It's just fascinating. But somehow we lost this connection to our bees, to insects, to the rest of nature. And really what happened was that during the Industrial Revolution, Lorenzo Langstroth in Philadelphia made the discovery of bee space and invented the movable frame hive. He put wooden frames around the wax combs, and now rather than killing off your bees to harvest the honey, you could now take these frames of honey, put them in a big centrifuge, spin the honey out of the combs, and then give that wax back to the bees. The bees secrete wax from their abdomens, and they mold it into those hexagonal cells. And in those cells, they raise their young and also store their honey. And they generally, if you harvest the honey before this time, you would have to mash up that comb and strain it to get the honey out, and the bees would have to make more new comb every year. And now that you could save the wax and give it back to the bees didn't have to make new beeswax. They could just take all those resources and make them into surplus honey. And basically the commercial beekeeping world was born overnight. These huge honey yields became possible, and it worked great. And I still have a lot of Langstroth hives, and I do spin those combs in an extractor. But within a couple decades, in the late 1800s, these contagious diseases started spreading from hive to hive, and then from bee yard to bee yard. The main one, of course, being American foul brood, this highly contagious spore-forming bacteria which can't be killed. It lives in the equipment for over 70 years. You can irradiate it or burn that equipment. And today, this is still the most serious bee disease that just appeared out of nowhere, because rather than like mashing and straining and removing this old beeswax comb from the hives and letting them grow new comb, now beekeepers were giving that comb back to the hives year after year and moving this comb from this hive to that comb, spreading the disease, developing this disease. And if a hive crashed, then it would die out, and another hive would come to rob it, and it would bring those spores back, and then they would get sick, and all the beehives in the community would start getting sick from these spores going here and there. So what the industry decided to do in light of this terrible disease affecting the bees was put pressure on every state government to ban hives that can't be inspected. That straw basket, I got one, tattooed right here. This is like my chalkboard. These are my credentials. This straw basket skep is now an illegal beehive, even though it's still the image that the public has of a beehive, this like dome-shaped straw. But you can't open it up to look for American foul brood. So we started a bee inspection program, a bee registration program. There's not a lot of enforcement for this in Oregon, but many states have bee inspectors and require your hives to be inspected every year for American foul brood. It's over 100 years later since this thing went rampant. And it was a brilliant ploy by the bee industry, because now everyone had to have a legally inspectable hive. A hive you could take apart, look for AFB, and put back together. So the skeps, the hollow logs, were now all illegal, and everyone had to convert to the only model that they were presented with was the Langstroth hive. That, of course, as you know, it costs hundreds of dollars to buy one of these hives. Beekeeping went from this common thing that everyone did to what it is today. It's this esoteric lost art. Even in this recent renaissance in beekeepers, it's a fraction of a percent of our population that actually are keeping bees today, because it's so expensive to get into. And so I was in this situation where I had a whole bunch of hives, 150, about that to 200 hives, and they needed more room. They were running out of room, and I didn't want to go into $40,000 of debt to get the Langstroth equipment for these bees. So I started looking at alternative hives, something that I could build for less than $5. And the only thing I found through research, calling people, looking on the internet, was what the Peace Corps was doing in countries like Kenya and Ethiopia, where they couldn't get the precision milled lumber. They were building what they were calling Kenyan top-bar hives. It was a long trough like that, and they were just laying sticks on this trough that the bees would build their combs off of. So I didn't know of anyone in the country. I'd never seen one, never heard of one, but I started doing the research, and I found two people. They were Wyatt Mangum in Virginia and Les Crowder in New Mexico, and both of them now have top bar beekeeping books and explain how to do it, and they've been doing it since the 80s or so with hundreds of hives with a lot of experience, and they'll show you how to build them. They both have excellent beekeeping books. So I contacted them, I asked them for some advice, how do I do this, and they said, the bees will teach you. They both said the same thing, you'll figure it out. And I'm like, okay, I guess I'm on my own. So I started building a bunch of these trough hives and putting my bees into them, and I really realized the benefits right from the get-go. I was building a good sized 3 or 4 foot long hive for less than $5. But really, these days, if you show me a dumpster, I can build you a couple of beehives out of the contents. It's that simple. I can build, dozens and dozens of these hives for the price of buying one Langstroth hive, and it really enabled me to have homes for my bees, and just so an illegally inspectable hive that I could go in, rate the health of the brood, and continue this breeding program that I was setting out on. So I realized some of the disadvantages of the top bars too. For one, it was very cheap. There was no heavy lifting, no heavy honey supers to take off the hive. The bees stayed very gentle. I wasn't exposing them to the atmosphere, like taking the lid off a Langstroth hive when all the bees are looking at you at once saying, hey, what do you think you're doing here? But I found that these top bar hives did tend to swarm more unless they were managed more constantly. I had to go in every 10 to 14 days to give them room in the brood nest, because in a horizontal hive, they'll grow, grow, grow. If they hit this wall of honey, then they'll feel honey-bound. They'll feel congested. Even if they have room in the back of their hive, they'll still feel congested if there's a wall of honey here, and they'll swarm before they reach their full potential. I realized I had to go in every 2 weeks or so, especially in the spring, and just put an empty top bar into the middle of that brood nest to get them to draw straight combs and give those young bees something to do so they wouldn't feel crowded and swarm. And I, at that point, had over 300 top bar hives, almost 400, I remember, and I had whole bee yards that were swarming, and I just couldn't keep up with them. And at the same time, Abbe Warre's book was translated from the French, and he promoted what he called a Warre hive. He was a French beekeeper in the 1940s, and he wrote a book called Beekeeping for All. It's a free download off of biobees.com, and it's a beautiful book with a beautiful philosophy. And Warre told his story that he had tried hundreds of different kinds of hive designs, and until he decided on what this is. This is a true dimension Warre hive right here, and Warre's whole approach, his methodology, was to just go to the hive twice a year. He would take this whole hive, pick it up in the spring, and put an empty box underneath and let the bees keep growing down. And then in the fall, he would come with a wire and slice off that top box and harvest the honey. And so you could think of it like an eternal hollow tree. The bees are constantly always working down. Their entrance was down low here, and bees, whether they're in a vertical hive or a horizontal hive, they always want to have their brood nest towards the entrance. That's where they can ventilate it the best, and they put their honey furthest from the entrance. So in my top bar horizontal hives, I had the entrance on one side. If I wanted to check the brood, I'd go in from that side, and then towards the back of the hive, that's where their honey area was. And if I wanted to harvest or check their stores, I'd go in from that side. And so in a vertical hive like this, a Warre hive or a Langstroth hive, our entrance, the bottom board, is down low, and so they always have their brood nests down here, and the top box is full of honey. When you harvest that top box, you're also harvesting the oldest comb out of the hive. And of course, the beeswax comb is like the liver of a beehive. Any pathogen in the hive goes into that beeswax. Any toxin in the environment goes in there. So it's good to renew this wax after every couple of years or so. So in this Warre hive, that's automatic. As they're moving their brood nest down, you're harvesting the honey and taking out the oldest comb. And so Warre said, don't open the hive otherwise. Let them swarm, let them supersede, let bees be bees, because bees know what they're doing. Bees are able to take care of themselves. And it's a beautiful approach, and it really resonates with new beekeepers these days, except for the fact that today's beekeeping world is not the same as it was in 1940s France. Back then, they didn't have Varroa mites. They didn't have all the diseases or the problems with brood, use of antibiotics. They didn't have changing weather. They didn't have years or as many years when the bees weren't able to feed themselves and find enough forage. The weather patterns were a little bit more predictable. It's a totally different beekeeping world these days. And so there's a lot more pressures on bees. And so I really recommend that people, beekeepers, actually monitor and to get a sense of the health of their hive and avoid buying bees year after year. Like I said, I don't it doesn't matter to me whether you treat your bees or not, or feed your bees or not. But what I do care about, and what I am interested in, is if you have to buy bees every year, or if you produce bees every year. I want you all to be producers, not consumers. And we're buying in more and more packaged bees from California or out of state that are just aren't adapted, and they're coming in with worse and worse viruses all the time. Whereas we really could make a sustainable beekeeping situation locally here. But that involves splitting your own hives, propagating your own survivor bees. And that involves like having to go into a hive and actually monitor and propagate and then rate them for health and things. So the Warre hive isn't a great model, or at least his approach isn't. So, but I was also attracted to the idea that you can leave bees alone and they won't be as swarming. They don't need as constant an inspection as a top bar hive. So what I did was take Warre's kind of basic dimensions and I modified them a bit to what I'm doing mostly today. So I made the boxes a little bit shorter. They're a little bit easier to get combs out of that way. And I also changed the whole methodology, the whole approach. I'm actually into these things really constantly and raising queens in them, and literally like a commercial production scale. And so since people have told me I've changed the dimensions and I've changed the whole philosophy, that I should stop calling them Warre hives and I should just call them comfort hives. Well, I'm not over that degree of pretentiousness yet to call them comfort hives. I still call them box hives. But basically I run about 600 of these little tiny boxes like so. And the Warre hive, he was... let's see, I'll show a little bit of the parts of this. And he was obviously a really good beekeeper and very observant, mimicking a hive that he found in a hollow tree. He had a quilt box that he put on top and filled with sawdust, like punky wood. Since I made hundreds and hundreds of these things, I never did the quilt box. But in his hives, he was putting these bars, like so. And so these bars, I started running these on a table saw and just stapling a very simple, low-key, easy-to-make bar rest and put these bars that I'd made on the table saw into here until I discovered this. This is the forefront of beekeeping technology. It's a barbecue skewer. It's a bamboo skewer that I cut down to 11 inches, and I'm putting 8 of these skewers onto these simple bar rests, and the bees grow their combs off of these skewers more or less perfectly. And then once I realized and I went with the barbecue skewers, I realized I could build this entire box without using a table saw. And so I just have a chop saw with a jig, and I can make hundreds of these boxes in a day, very simply, very quickly. So I have little baby ones, and I have like really big hives also, all sizes. My big hives I tend to just leave alone, let them do their thing, but I can split them in the spring. I'll come with a hive that's like 3 or 4 of these boxes tall. I'll slice them apart. I use a long bread knife to do the slicing, and I put each of these boxes onto their own screen bottom board, like so. And then I will take a divider, just a little piece of sheet metal, like so, and slide it right into the middle of this box, and I'll make this one single box into 2 baby hives. 4 combs here, 4 combs here, an entrance on this side and an entrance on that side. So this little 4-comber is, I call it a baby nuke. It's like a baby mating nuke. Once I slide this divider back out later in the season, this is about a toddler size for me. Once they're 2 boxes tall, I start calling them a teenager size. And once they're teenagers, they have to start finding jobs of their own and start feeding themselves. I might feed a little bit of the babies or with the splitting if I do it at the wrong time of the year, if the weather's really bad, or if it's an emergency situation. I will feed them sugar syrup, but once they're teenager size to adults, they're pretty much cut off and they have to feed themselves. So I am like definitely stressing out some of my bees and like systematically killing them off. It's we can call it tough love apiaries, but I'm totally different. I'm not doing migratory pollination. I'm not trying to stock store shelves with tons and tons of honey. I'm interested in having bees that can survive without too much human manipulation and without the artificial crutches, have a couple hives in the backyard that will survive with minimal inputs. Totally different than what the majority of the bee industry is doing. And so I'm using a lot of these industry tactics, that process of grafting, to kind of reverse some of the trends that have been going on for the last over a century. So I'll make it into these little baby hives, and I'll go into a little bit of what commercial production is, and then I'll talk a little bit more about what you can do in your backyard to make bees. But I run 600 of these little mating nukes. I call them. And I've simplified this commercial queen production down to a weekly system, whereas every Monday I'm grafting. I'm taking that grafting tool and putting the larvae from the breeder hives into those little cups and putting them into the cell raisers. Then every Tuesday I go to the mating nukes and I start catching queens. I'll go in here, and as long as the queen is laying eggs and I see her eggs and she has capped brood, and it has to be capped worker brood to know that she was well inseminated on her mating flight and she'll be a good queen, I'll find her, get her in my hands, and I'll put her into a little cage like this, and I'll put 5 attendant bees in this cage, and I'll pass this on around if you want to check that out.
Here's this.
Okay. Thank you. So and then, so I'll do that on Tuesday, start catching the queens. And let's say I work 200 of these nukes a week. And I do this set this week, then another 200, then another 200, and I'm back to this set after 3 weeks. By 3 weeks, these little baby hives are just bubbling over with bees and they're out of room. So let's say I get 100% mating, you know, all the queens go out on their mating flight and 100% of them make it back. That means I get 200 queens in those cages every week. And also I have to take a comb of brood out of every single nuke so they have room to go another 3 weeks. So I'll get 200 little combs of brood like this every week. You can imagine the constant equipment crisis that I'm in. So I take the first couple dozen combs of brood that I am taking out of the mating nukes on that Tuesday, I'll put above a queen excluder, which is just like a little sheet that the bees can get through, but any queen on that hive won't be able to get up onto this brood, because I want this brood to be totally capped, to have no eggs or no larvae, because the next week I'm going to take that brood that I've banked, we call it, they're above that queen excluder, and I'll put it into next week's cell raisers. So I'm constantly taking brood from these mating nukes, banking it for a week, and then the following week that's the brood that goes into the hives that are raising the queen cells. So that next Wednesday, I'll catch more queens and finish out that set of 200 nukes. And then Thursday, I will get those ripe queen cells from the cell raisers and put them into the nukes where I've been catching queens. So these little mating nukes, they sit queenless for 1 to 2 days, and then I replace those mated queens with a ripe queen cell. That queen cell will emerge in another day or 2, and the virgin queen a week later will go on a mating flight, and then I let them go another 2 weeks. So it's a total of 3 weeks after I place that cell that I'm back into this nuke. And if the queen makes it back from her mating flight, then they'll be ready to remove her, take her to the post office, take some brood out of this nuke, and I just do the whole system again and again. And I know what I'm doing every single day of the year. I do 10 weeks of queen rearing like this in Florida where I have bees, and 10 weeks in New York in the summer. And so, you know, those queens don't always make it back, and I have extra brood here to fix up the misses. You know, that queen, she goes out on her mating flight, she could get eaten by a purple martin or by a dragonfly, she could get struck by lightning or hit by a plane, but I don't know what happens to some of them, but generally we hope for about 80% that come back. So even with 80%, I have plenty of brood to stock the cell raisers and keep them going, to fix the misses where the queens didn't make it back to the mating nuke, give them a little bit of brood so these little baby hives can keep going. And I always have extra brood, and that extra brood I give them a queen from that week, and I put them into an outyard, another bee yard that I have that's not my mating yard. And really the only reason I have these outyards and other apiaries around is to test the breeding stock. I mark the queens that I keep. I give them a little dot of paint. This year's red. I think last year was yellow. The year before that is white. I'm mostly raising queens from blue dot, raising these daughter queens from blue dot mothers, which means they're in their 4th year. I lost my last couple of green dots. So, and this is an international color code set by the International Bee Research Association. So even if I go to other countries and I see a red dot queen, I know she's from this year. It's pretty cool in that regard. And some people mark them so they can find them easier. I usually can find them, but I have bad days too, not being able to find queens. But I'm marking them so I know who they are and how old they are, and I keep track usually about 15 different families. And I put these families in these outyards and let them grow up to be full-size adult hives to test for their mite resistance, their disease resistance, their ability to survive winter. And winter for me in New York is usually 20 below 0. You know, they really have to have all their ducks in a row, all their bees in the basket to survive that. You know, they have to be pretty disease-free with low mite levels to survive a winter like that in confinement for months. And I test their honey production, their temperament, everything that's important to people who want to buy queens from me. And so since I started organizing the system and getting it as simple as possible, having this self-contained mating yard, whereas the brood from the mating nukes is going to the cell-raising hives, and the cells from those hives go back to the mating nukes, it really has made everything click. And of course, because of that break in the brood cycle that I talked about, these mating nukes are almost virtually mite-free. And that's the brood that's going to the cell raisers, and this kind of really sustainable one big mating yard that really drives the whole operation. I see I'm there 4 days out of the week, and once I let them grow up, they have to fend for themselves. But I got so organized, and I figured that this was as simple as I could possibly make this commercial style queen production, that I started teaching workshops, a 4-day queen rearing intensive, that they could see the whole system: grafting, catching more, and then putting the cells in. So more people could do this kind of thing and even go into a livelihood as raising queens these days, and not have to go to almond pollination to get a livelihood with bees, or not have to make tons and tons of honey. But after 4 days, people seeing this system, a lot of them would say, "This is way too much work. We're just going to buy queens from you." And that wasn't the idea, because I want more people to have a sustainable life with bees. And I realized that, people can get hung up on the grafting and setting up the cell raisers, and just this commercial bent of queen rearing, it can almost be like a curse. And so I've been doing a lot more experiments with just letting the bees raise their own queens, more like in an emergency situation, and what is called a walkaway split. Say you have a strong hive in the spring, you can just slice it in half. Usually before they swarm, if they're gonna swarm, you got a hive that's 2 boxes tall, you can just take 1 box and move it to a new place, even in the same bee yard, and then you walk away. It's a walk-away split. Whatever side is queenless will build a queen in the absence of a queen. They will pick several larvae and feed them extra royal jelly. It's actually a higher sugar content in that royal jelly that makes that larva, rather than becoming a worker bee, it'll develop into a queen and emerge faster, but she's twice as big. She develops her ovaries. She's physiologically a different bee, but comes from the same genetics that a worker bee, a stunted female. Worker bees are basically stunted queens. They're infertile females. So, but they all, as a fertilized egg, they all have the potential to become a queen. So bees will pick several of these larvae and build a queen. So I started doing a bunch of experiments, dequeening hives using extra queen cells, until I got it down just a simple recipe of just taking a frame of eggs and larvae, or a frame or a comb. I don't really use frames anymore. Taking a comb of larvae and young eggs, and an extra comb of food, nectar, honey, pollen in there, and a couple extra shakes of bees, and putting that into a small box, and then just coming back in a month to seeing what happens. And often they'll raise 4 or 5 or more queen cells, and we have some research that now shows that the bees are chewing down the inferior queen cells, either by pheromones or they get a sense of their weight. They're actually culling out and have a conscious quality control, so they can get one of the better quality cells are the ones that emerge and becomes the mother of that little baby hive. And so really, you can do this in your own backyard, like really simply. You can really make as many little baby hives as you have combs of eggs or larvae, and you don't have to do that grafting process. Again, that grafting process, you can raise 40 or 50 queen cells per hive. That splitting process of the walkaway split, you can make 1 queen in your new hive like that, or you can catch a swarm, whereas you're making 1 new queen in your baby hive, and hopefully catching your swarm and getting 2 hives from 1. But you can also go into your hive and just give every box, every piece of equipment you have, give it a comb of eggs and larvae, give it a comb of food, and just a couple extra shakes of bees, a couple extra clumps of young bees, so there's plenty of young bees in there to raise a queen. And if this doesn't work, you check them in 3 or 4 weeks later. If they fail to do it, you can always recombine them with nothing lost. And really, splitting is something that you can do even in your first year as a beekeeper. It'd be great for every new beekeeper to go into winter with 2 big hives and 2 backup nukes. It's a really good idea. People call me like late in the season in an emergency. They lost their queen. They only have 1 hive. It's been queenless for 6 months or something like that. And I'd really rather not sell a queen in an emergency situation. Really, in the peak of your season, make backup hives. Have more bees to back up your big hives. So that's a really, you can sustain your own numbers that way. And you can even winter these small baby hives. You can push them together. You can wrap them. You can put them on top of bigger hives so the heat rises and heats the little babies. That helps them out a little bit. But really, there's like many different ways to do that. So I mean, You can just catch the swarm to make 2 hives out of 1. You can just do a walkaway split, making 2 hives out of 1. You can split them all into little baby nuke boxes and make as many hives as you have combs of larvae. If you're having trouble finding your queens or don't want to have to do that, you can take up your survivor hive, pick it up, move that hive to the new position, and then where the field force is, all the field and older bees coming back to this spot, put your empty box there and move back some resources so they can build a queen there. Move back a comb of eggs and larvae. Move back one that doesn't have the queen on it. A little bit of food, resources, maybe a little bit of extra young bees so they can raise a queen. The young bees are the ones that produce royal jelly from the hypopharyngeal glands. They're the ones that are building a queen. So if you can't find a queen or don't want to find a queen, move your big hive and just move back the resources, and you can do it that way and make 2 hives out of 1. There's many different ways to split, and the whole idea is just like giving it a try. You know, and you'll eventually kill a hive, you'll eventually get stung, you'll eventually make mistakes, but that's like part of beekeeping, and you've got to take the fear out of doing that. And learning more about bee biology is the best thing you can do. The only way to do that is learning about your bees and doing what is in your, seeing what's going on in your backyard. Yeah, you had a question, sir.
Yeah. Okay, with the Warre hives, which box, let's say I've got 3 boxes, and I'm going to do a walkaway split. Which box do I take?
Yeah, well, with the Warre, since these are, it's pretty difficult to get these combs out and see what's in there, you can just generally assume that if you got 3 boxes, your top one is probably all honey. You know, and whatever box you move to the new position, it's going to lose its field force. They're going to lose the bees that are going out and foraging, like that, because all the foragers always come back home. If you put a new hive here, they're not going to have any field force for like a week or 2, like that. So you definitely want to put some honey here. And, you know, you can assume you want, you know, if you're not going to go in and find the queen, and which often these aren't straight, you have to cut the side attachments in here, I would probably put more resources into the new position. So what I would do is, say it's 3 high, I would take the top 2 boxes, and run it with either like a piano wire like Warre did, or a long bread knife. Take 2 boxes and move those here. And then this box that's gonna still have all the field bees, you can put another empty box underneath it so they can keep working down. But this will be, you don't want to leave this as a single box because you'll have all the field bees and they'll just be bubbling out and not have enough room. So give them an empty box underneath at the same time. So you got a 2-box tall hive here and a 2-box tall hive there. And then within about a month, you're gonna know if it worked or not. And you can always throw it back together.
When in the season would you suggest doing that?
I like following bee biology. You'll have a lot more success like that. Your swarm season. You know, if you have dandelions or stuff like that, when bees start swarming, when they start raising drones, when you start seeing drones flying, then it's usually about time that the bees are going to be splitting themselves. So otherwise, the other times of year, you're going to be fighting against their instincts. It can be done, especially if you're doing supplemental feeding. You want to build up a little earlier or extend the season into dearth times a little bit later. You can like push the envelope that way, but your best queens and your highest success rate will come during swarm season when the bees are naturally doing it themselves. So I'm not trying to convert you all to be, do bees in these alternative kinds of boxes. You know, this is all alternative hives for alternative minds. But I will tell you that after about 5 or 6 years of working commercial beekeeping jobs, that first year that I tried top bar hives and then Warre hives and started building my own boxes, I learned so much more about bees, way more than I had in the whole 5 years prior combined. Because I just could observe bees, what they do when left to their own devices in a hollow space like this, learning about their biology and just having something to compare to. And I became a much better beekeeper because of it. So even if you're not going to convert to top bars or Warre hives, if you're just going to keep langs, I still recommend building either a top bar or like an alternative hive, a box hive, a Warre hive, just to see what bees do and further your beekeeping along by just learning more about what bee behavior is like. And again, also trying new things. And my whole beekeeping is about maintaining my sense of awe, my sense of wonder, and making beekeeping fun again. Because the commercial bee world especially is losing the sense of fun, of wanting to go out there every day because it's so much work and there's so much propping up of bees these days. Where beekeeping doesn't have to be like that. We can capitalize and really augment the bee's own strengths, get them on a healthier footing, making it a lot more enjoyable to see their success and just work more symbiotically with the bees to make them stronger again, rather than going the route of livestock and stuff. So it's really important, and like I will tell you, if you know, the next time that you open up a hive or go to a bee meeting or get a bee magazine, bring a young person along. You probably, those of you who are beekeepers, remember that first day that you opened up a beehive. That first time you smelled what was going on there, you saw that all that nectar glistening in the sun. It's a moment that none of us will ever forget. And this is something that we can pass on to the next generation. Get this connection, this really only connection to the insect world and the rest of the world of nature, to be part of this thing that is just bigger than ourselves. So that's my best recommendation I can give you all. Keep more than one hive. You'll be a lot better off being able to share resources and juxtaposing. And yeah, try lots of different things that interest you. Try building your own bee boxes and just further your own connection with your own little bee friends. And so I'm going to sing you a couple more bee songs probably, but I can take a few more questions first. Yeah.
When should we be harvesting honey from a Warre hive?
This is probably the more local experts that would know. For me, I know the blackberry flow is a huge honey flow here. Yeah, I know you get clover and stuff like that. Generally never in its first year, because you can always leave the resources on the hive. It avoids a lot more sugar feeding. Maybe you do have to feed sugar. It all depends on where you get your bees from and things like that. So you can always harvest it the next spring. You know, even if it's crystallized, you can just warm it a little bit to strain it, or just eat it as comb honey, stuff like that.
I've got a 4-box hive with the second, and I've had for 2 years now. This is the second year. So, assuming I can take that whole top box off.
You might be able to. I mean, because like right now, this time of year, they're shrinking their brood nest. The queen is laying less eggs, the less mouths to feed for winter. And since they are, like I said, they keep their brood nest down low. That top box should be full of honey. You want to keep the honey separate from the nectar. You can take that top box off and then just lift the hive. Some people even put it onto a scale to see how heavy it is. And again, you'll have to talk to a local expert to see how much honey they need to get through a winter in this environment. I know it's not as much as I need in New York. I leave about 100 pounds of honey on these hives. I would want one that's probably at least 3 or 4 tall. You know, and I do like winter my little baby hives too, but I usually like push them together or wrap them so they can share heat that way, and they eat less food like that. So you can take off your top box of honey and then get a sense if you still have some weight down low, you know. So that's the best recommendation I can give you. You can leave it on until spring or until the next honey flow, and at that point they really won't need it like that by the time dandelions come next year. But if you're 4 boxes tall, you probably have a box of honey on there after 2 years. But I don't know, the years keep getting weirder. You know, there is no normal anymore. I'm leaving more and more honey on the hives just to avoid the sugar feeding. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, speaking of sugar feeding, I just wondering what you think about supplemental feeding and are there alternatives to sugar feeding, like
yeah, nobody wants to feed bees, but I mean, I'm able to like make more bees and keep more numbers and sell bees to people. You know, not just queens, but also like I produce package bees and nukes and things like that as well. And you know, especially in raising queens, I want everyone to be super well nourished. But I feed my cell raisers honey of my own honey like that. You don't really want to buy anyone else's honey. Like honey on the store shelves, a lot of it isn't honey. For one thing, a lot of it's been heated, which puts HMF in it, which can be toxic to bees. A lot of it has antibiotics in it. And a lot of it isn't honey anyway. And it can have brood diseases too if it doesn't have antibiotics, you know, or hasn't been heated. So yeah, your own honey is best for the bees. And I don't over harvest. I always leave bees enough, and I'm only feeding in emergency situations. I also don't harvest from every hive every year like that. And I'll do some Robin Hooding as well. I'll rob from the rich and give to the poor. The nukes that I make too late in the season, or it might need some food, and I'll move honey around while there's some to move around. But I will also feed sugar syrup, like just to get them through, you know.
What time of year are you doing the feeding?
I'm probably right about now, starting September. Well, I mean, I have a very good goldenrod flow, usually. Goldenrods and astards that usually go up into the frost, but 2 years ago we were in drought in New York and the goldenrod failed. So I had to do a lot of feeding, and starting in usually like late August, September. If you're like making splits, Generally, I stop making splits into July, but if I were willing to feed more, I can make splits into August even, but they would need a lot. I'd have to make those splits stronger and definitely do supplemental feeding on those. But even sometimes now, making splits into July, which is like kind of following bees' own swarming cycles, I find that some of them still do need feed, and I'll get a sense within a couple weeks after making that split, starting in August or September, of giving them some food. And I only feed to, to make sure that they're heavy enough. So I tend to feed a thick syrup, a 2-to-1 by weight, sugar to water, like that. Some people will stimulate them by feeding a 1-to-1 in the spring, just so their bees are stronger earlier to take advantage of dandelions. And it's all about your philosophy and things like that. But I will tell you that bees that are well nourished are definitely less stressed, and they can handle diseases and other things like that and keep those levels down if they have full bellies. And they're also gentler, and just like they can do what bees, they can take advantage of their own natural defenses if they have the proper nutrition like that. I don't do any protein supplements or anything like that. I do. I buy in some pollen, just some trapped real bee pollen, to help feed the queen cell raisers like that, because I just want them to be as well nourished as possible to make the best queens like that in that system. So yeah, there's, again, a lot of it has to do with your bee philosophy, but I think you can even feed past the frost. People say it can cause moisture issues in the hive, but if it's warm enough, my weather patterns are changing. Like in the Northeast, usually it used to get cold after the frost mid-October and stay cold until March or so. And these days it's like we still get a killing frost in October, but it's 70 some degrees up through December, and the bees are just flying every day, flying, looking for food that isn't there, burning through their stores. And then winter hits in December, January, and it lingers until April or May. So I'm still getting most of my bees through, but they can't forage in March like they were used to getting, and they're just like very small still, but then they explode and take off when the dandelions do finally come around. So it keeps them on their toes. It keeps me on my toes. I know that. It's keeping bees in changing times, but I'm convinced that the bees will be just fine. It's humans I'm more worried about. It's not colony collapse disorder, it's more like people collapse disorder. We have a lot to learn about the bees. They are resilient and versatile, and they're going to be just fine. So,
I have a couple of questions. What do you think about sprinkling powdered sugar on the bees to help them clean the mites off themselves?
Yeah, I don't monitor for mites, but I'm constantly making bees and breaking the brood cycle, and I have hundreds and hundreds of hives and stuff. But if you only have a couple hives, and especially if it's the difference between treating them some way and having to buy more bees every year, we're starting to teach people that they shouldn't buy bees. Just put up like swarm traps, work with your friends. If your friends' bees do better, maybe they can give you back a split. If your hives die, keep it local and stuff like that. But if it's a matter of like treating your hive versus like having to buy commercial package bees the following year, it's better off to treat them.
My bees to swarm.
That's great.
This last year.
Yeah.
2 years ago, I had like 14 hives. During the winter, I lost 9 of them, so I'm down to 5. And I built a bee house.
Oh, nice.
It holds 5 hives in there.
Cool,
and also,
cool.
This last year, I built a bee observatory. I'm trying to get them to build down.
This is rad.
I took a kitchen cabinet. They can open up the door. I put a pane of glass in there.
Oh, this is awesome.
On top, I put a bee box, and I cut one of those plastic frames or the foundation, and I stuck them down there.
Yeah.
When I first caught a swarm from one of my other hives, I think I had 2 queens in the box.
Yeah.
Because at first there was a lot of bees, then half of them were gone. They never really built down in the bee observatory this year, so I'm seeing what they'll do.
Yeah.
But my other hives, there was like 2 left in the bee house, and I think I got 9 swarms.
My goodness.
Off that.
Great.
I mean, every day I'd go out there around noon.
Are you retired? Yeah, I was wondering if you can hang around, just catch swarms. It's a great way to get bees.
The bee house is under a oak tree. So they would just go up to a branch. I'd collect it, stick it in a box, and stick it aside. Next day, same thing. Another one in another branch. And so it's for a couple weeks. I just,
What's your address so we know where to put our beta?
Cool. I was wondering, to help them survive. See, I thought by building a bee house, they survived the winter better. Yeah. But last year it really didn't.
Benefit from insulation, and here last winter was like very long, very cold and tough for them. And yeah, well, you mean mites do kill bees. My t-shirt says like treatment stupid, you know. But like swarming, like I said, breaking the brood cycle really knocks them down. But they can get reinfested by if you have hive, those bees, as they're crashing from Varroa and disease loads, can drift into the other hives. Even if the other hives have healthy, like low mite levels, they can pick up through this drifting process. So it is like, yeah, I mean, like there's powdered sugar, things like that. Yeah.
Well, to break up the mite cycle or whatever, you take the swarm and put it in a new hive, and they don't have.
Yeah.
They shouldn't have any brood in there. Now they might carry a few mites. But then how long do the mites live? Do they just live?
Oh yeah, they can live a long time through winter and things like that.
So they can wait it out until the brood starts to die, and then they'll.
Every hive has mites. It's true, and that's whether you treat them or not. You never kill all the mites with any of the treatments. And powdered sugars are a tougher one that you have to do like repeatedly, because you're only like dusting the mites that are on the bees, and the bees like invigorate their grooming. But 90% of your mites are in the capped brood. You want to do that 2 or 3 times. You're using like oxalic acid, is spraying that on the bees.
I really don't. I fear. They live, and they die, they die.
I mean, I don't I count my mites through like an alcohol roll or a sugar roll like that, but I have a very good sense of, I read the larva and the health of the larva and see if there's even a miscolored larva or like a sunken larva, which could be malnourishment, or it could be a mite vectored bacteria or virus and stuff, like a snot brood is this umbrella term. You look for shriveled wings. Often like under my nukes I have screen bottoms, and I can look at those bottom boards. I can see mites on bees. I get a really good sense.
So
you can uncap brood.
Should the hive have?
Here it's pretty damp, and like, well, the nice thing about beekeeping is there really isn't a recipe for it. You don't like set up your hive like this. It's not like planting a seed where you water it and then you weed around it and then harvest in the fall. Beekeeping is nothing like that at all. It's so localized, and of course, like your bee yard will be totally different than another bee yard 2 miles down the road, of like how much ventilation you need. I tend to, when I stack up my boxes, the 4 or 5 tall for winter, I leave every box has an entrance like that, and I leave them all open for winter for ventilation. There's a lot of mixed feelings about that, about a top entrance or not. You know, if they're gonna get buried in the snow, then definitely they need something that can breathe. Some people say a top entrance lets all the heat out of the hive, but I think maybe a mid entrance is also good in addition to a lower entrance. You're pretty damp here.
The boxes stack up inside. There's just one entrance.
Just one entrance.
Yeah. And so I didn't know, because when it's really hot in the summer, I will crack the top lid to let a little airflow through.
Yeah.
But in the winter time, I don't know if I should have like some type of screen bottom on it.
Well, you got some of them through, so that's a good sign, and you are breeding bees like that by catching those swarms, those survivor genetics like that. And like, this is a recommendation for anyone. You know, think of your management system, what kind of beekeeper you want to be, what kind of hive design you want to build the bee house. Yeah, that's we all aspire to that.
I really don't want to open up the box.
Sure.
I get stung too, and I don't like it.
Oh, okay. I do, but I'm different. Yeah. But really, I mean, anyone that you aspire to be a lazy beekeeper, or do less inputs, less management, and think of inputs, outputs, basic permaculture, and that's like the approach that I got into bees. Like, how much work is this gonna be? You know, it can be as much work as you make it. It can be endless work.
I just like to set up the box. I like catching the swarms.
Oh yeah, that's fun.
You know, when they just fill the air, and then you see them start. They landed. She landed on that branch there.
Yeah.
I'll go get my ladder, and usually when I just take a frame and stick it up against.
Oh, cool! And they crawl onto
it.
it.
Then I can check and see when I catch the queen and stick her in a box. I just want to stick them in a box, and then once they all go in there, I'll.
I think you'll find. You'll find that you'll have more success overwintering this year because you're propagating your own survivors, and this goes for everyone. You know, whatever beekeeper you want to be. Like, think of your system. Get a bunch of bees and put them into your system. And then plan on having some of them die off, especially that first year, that first winter. But then, like, rather than buying more bees, split the survivors and keep them in your system, and you'll find instantly that very next generation, you know, the success rate will go up. You know, and then for me, every year, every generation of bees, they get stronger and stronger, more adapted the way I want to do things. Bees are resilient like that. Yeah.
Well, I had a hive, and I did nothing with it except put another top box on it. and Brian, who works here, came to my house and caught a swarm that I had. The swarm left. For some reason, those bees left. And they'd been there for 3 or 4 years through all the freezes and everything. And I bought a nuke from Brian, but I harvested just the honey in the top box, and I got over a gallon. And it was the best honey ever. You know, and I just treat it like it's just habitat for the bees and hope for the best for them. You know.
Cool though.
Yeah. Warre.
Yeah. They could have failed to have their queen come back from the mating flight or something like that. Usually they do, you know. But I think Winnie the Pooh said it best: "You never can tell with bees." Cool. Well, I think
you can just, you know, let them be.
Yeah. We got a few minutes left. We can sing you another song or two if you want to bail. Ray, you want to come up? Yeah. Solomon, you got anything that you want to add back there? Solomon's just south of here. Solomon runs, I'm going to tell them that you run the treatment-free beekeeping Facebook page with 30,000 members on it. So, he's been identified. And Ray keeps about 50 hives in Michigan. So, also a very difficult climate for bees to survive. Bees are a tropical creature to begin with. They've adapted to our system. There are bees, but now there are bees in Siberia, Scandinavia. They're so versatile, you know, and they've been around a lot longer than we have.
And to provide a sort of alternate perspective, like I don't identify as a treatment-free beekeeper. I like to think of myself as approaching treatment-free, as a lot of beekeepers do, but as a result of the mentorship that I've received in the community that I'm a part of, treatment is really, that is the thing that you do in my community. And if you don't, then people want to talk to you about it because they blame you for them having mites. I'm not trying to, you know, get people to disagree here by any means. I think there's lots of ways to keep bees, and I think that there, like Sam said, are lots of good beekeepers out there who are treatment beekeepers, treatment-free beekeepers. But I can talk to anybody who is interested in the sort of like organic acid approach to miticides. That includes formic acid and oxalic acid. I've done dribble method, I do vaporization, I've done the Walkaway quick strips, which is like the wax pad impregnated with formic acid. If people have questions about those things, I can try and field them a little bit if that's helpful for anybody. But mostly I would say a huge difference I'm seeing in my apiary is getting good genetics in. Generally when you're getting mass-produced nukes and packages, you might not be getting stock that's as hardy or as mite tolerant as you'd want if you want to be a treatment-free beekeeper. So I would say look into getting better stock from your neighbors who are beekeepers who have said, oh, I haven't treated this hive and it's been alive for 3 years. Go get some eggs from them, or get a comb of brood or something and try and raise your own queen from their stock. Or call someone like Sam and say, hey, I want to buy a queen, or I want to buy 10, whatever. All my friends want them too. I sell queens too and put them in the mail. I have some of Sam's stock that I'm combining with survivor stock that I have in Michigan, and I'm trying to create a more winter hardy, mite resistant Michigan bee. And so there's lots of us out here in the field who are trying to address this problem from different angles, and just want to say there are lots of options out there and nobody should be demonized for what they choose to do. I think that's really the point I'm trying to make especially. But that if anybody has questions about treatment, when to do it, how to do it, what might be the best way to do it, I could talk to you about that. So just wanted to say.
Rad. Cool. What do you want to sing? Should we do Love Song of the Drone?
Yeah.
Maybe? Yeah, okay. We talked a lot about queens, a little bit about drones, so we gotta like even out the playing field. And
I brought this accordion, so I should break it out.
Thank you very much.
Oh yeah, sure. Take care. Can you do it in F?
Sure.
So that minor would be what a G. What's the minor would go to? Beats me.
Just a D.
Got it. All right. Sounds pretty in tune. All right. Well, I'm gonna put my drone glasses on. Okay, this is the love song of the drone. I am just a drone and I can't live on my own. I can't make no honey for the hive.
Do something.
I can't land on my feet. I am clumsy but I'm sweet. And I'm stuck congregating with all these guys in the skies. Want some honey home, just call your honey home. I am just a drone, but you are a queen. And if you want some honey home, just call your honey home. Life is but a dream, as sweet as it seems. So high in the atmosphere, baby, I wish you were here. I got eyes that can see the world, and I'll share it with you, girl. I'm not afraid to fly, but I'm scared my destiny lies to just keep hanging round till I'm frozen on the ground. I am just a drone, and for a little pheromone, I'll follow you through the hive. But there's pollen in the field, and I know how to keep it real. And if we seal the deal, I know I'll die, but I don't mind. 'Cause if you want some honey home, just call your honey home. I am just a drone, but you are a queen. If you want some honey home, just call your honey home. Life is but a dream, as sweet as it seems. Thanks, everybody. Good luck with your bees. Yeah. All right.
Nice job there.
Thank you.